Okay, what if I told you there's a secret mathematical code hidden inside your DNA? Today, we are diving into a really wild and, yeah, pretty controversial idea that says exactly that. I mean, think about it. What if the very code that makes you, well, you, follows the same beautiful patterns you see in nature? You know, like the perfect spiral of a seashell or the seeds in a sunflower. Sounds like science fiction, right? Well, that's the core claim from a researcher named Jean-Claude Perez. His theory is pretty out there. He's saying that underneath the A's, T's, C's, and G's we all know about, there's another layer, a hidden language of pure math, kind of like a ghost in the machine. And look, if he's even remotely right, this could totally flip what we think we know about everything, evolution, disease, you name it. So let's get into how this whole thing is supposed to work. All right, first things first. To get our heads around this, we need to look at a very specific part of our genome. So we're not talking about the big strands of DNA in your chromosomes. Nope. We're zooming in on something called mitochondrial DNA, or MTDNA. This is the stuff that powers our cells. And here's the absolute key, the detail that makes this whole theory even possible. It's a circle. It's a closed loop. There's no start and there's no end. So how in the world do you find a math pattern in a circle of DNA? Okay, Perez's method it's pretty complex, not gonna lie. But let's try to break it down. Imagine you just pick a random spot on that DNA circle. Then you count out a specific number of bases along the chain, and that number has to be a Fibonacci number, from that famous sequence. Now, here's the cool part. You look at the chunk of DNA you just marked off. If the chemical bases inside that chunk are also split up according to the previous Fibonacci numbers, boom, you found what he calls a Fibonacci resonance. It's like the code is echoing itself, creating this perfect mathematical harmony. And this is where it gets really interesting. When you run this analysis on different species, you get these totally different results. Just look at this chart. It's comparing the resonances in us, sapiens, with our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans. See those high, sharp peaks for the Neanderthals and Denisovans? That means they had fewer but really long, really powerful resonances. But then look at the sapiens line, us. It's much lower, much broader. That means we have a whole bunch of shorter resonances. So the idea is that every species might have its own unique mathematical fingerprint. Okay, so to really test this theory, to push it to its absolute limit, Perez came up with this brilliant thought experiment. It's basically digital genetic engineering. He asked a simple question. What if we could design the perfect genome? Not in a wet lab with test tubes, but entirely inside a computer. And so he built a simulation, something he called the Neanderthal GMO, a purely hypothetical, genetically modified organism. And here's the recipe for this creation. First, you start with the complete mitochondrial DNA of a chimpanzee. Then, you digitally splice in two very specific, very small fragments of Neanderthal DNA taken from a fossil. What you end up with is this hybrid genome, something that never, ever existed in nature. It's a mashup of two species separated by a huge gulf of time. And then you run the numbers. You look for those resonances. The result was just staggering. I mean, this tiny little genome, only about 16,000 bases long, it generated a mathematical resonance pattern that was over 2 million bases long. That is just nuts. Think about it like this. It's like writing a single sentence that creates a meaningful echo longer than the entire novel it's in. The scale is just off the charts. But wait, it gets even crazier. They introduced just one single common mutation, literally just flipping one letter, and the resonance more than doubled. It exploded to almost 5 million bases. To really wrap your head around that number, a resonance that long on a genome that short is like a signal wrapping around that tiny DNA loop almost 300 times. 300. It's like a tiny particle accelerator with this mathematical signal just whipping around, reinforcing itself over and over and over again. So you gotta ask, why? What was so special about this Franken genome? The answer is unbelievable. It's pure math. When they looked at the ratio of its chemical building blocks, it was almost a perfect match for the golden ratio, for phi. You know, the same number you find in galaxies and seashells? This computer simulation had spontaneously arranged itself into a mathematically perfect structure. Just wow. But what does it even mean for a living thing to be perfect? Turns out being perfect might come with a very, very steep price. Yeah, Perez points out that for any super complex system, once you hit that peak of optimization, perfection and fragility basically become synonyms. Think about it. When you're at the absolute perfect peak, any change, any little tweak can only push you downhill. It can only make things worse. And this is where it all connects back to the real world, with a pretty stunning hypothesis. What if the actual Neanderthal genome was a lot like this perfect computer model? So mathematically optimized, so stable that it just couldn't mutate. Because any mutation would wreck its perfect harmony. Now, in a stable environment, that's a winning strategy. You're perfectly adapted. But what happens when the world changes fast, like during an ice age? You can't adapt. You're too rigid. You break, and you go extinct. So, okay, that's a really fascinating, though definitely speculative, idea about extinction. But what about us, here and now? If a perfect mathematical pattern equals stability, what happens when that pattern starts to break down inside our own bodies? Well, researchers looked at hundreds of tiny mutations in our MTDNA, ones we know are linked to diseases like cancer. And they found this incredibly consistent, almost bizarre pattern. These disease-related mutations, they almost always increase the number of short, almost chaotic resonance patterns. But here's the kicker, the other side of the coin. At the very same time, those exact same mutations consistently decrease the long, stabilizing resonances. You know, the kind of powerful patterns we saw in our ancestors and in that perfect computer model? It's like the whole system is losing its long-range order and just dissolving into a bunch of short-range static. This table here really sums it all up. This is from a study of 100 different mutations linked to disease. And the results are, well, they're pretty stark. Look at this, 100% of the time. Every single time, these bad mutations created more of that short-range noise. And at the same time, almost 2/3 of them actively destroyed the long-range stabilizing patterns. So what does that look like? It looks like disease is a breakdown of mathematical order. So what are we supposed to make of all this? Where does this leave us? Well, it points to this incredible possibility that there's a second layer of information written into our DNA. A whole other operating system based on principles we're just now, maybe, starting to glimpse. Now, I have to be clear, this is still a very speculative idea. It's on the fringe. But the really cool part is that it isn't just a what if. It actually makes real, testable predictions. It suggests that we should be able to find correlations between these math patterns and how our brains work. It even suggests the act of learning something new might literally change these resonances in our DNA. It's a bold idea for sure, but it's one that scientists can actually take into the lab and try to prove or disprove. And that brings us to one last, really provocative thought from Perez. Right now, today, we are actively rewriting the code of life with things like GMOs and gene editing. But what if we're only reading half the message? What if this theory is right, and there's this deep, mathematical music playing in the background, a code within the code, and we're just crashing through it, disrupting a harmony we don't even know is there? It leaves you with a pretty good question, doesn't it? Are we really ready to start editing a language that we can't yet fully read?